Hey everybody, meteorologist Brad Panovich here. Update on Dorian as it becomes a huge Category 5 storm, one of the strongest storms in Atlantic records. So let's get right to the details because this is a serious situation. This was the 9:30 advisory, which was an intermediate advisory because the hurricane hunters were out there. They were detecting that the storm was getting stronger. Pressure's down to 922 millibars, but the important thing here is the winds are up to 175 miles per hour with gusts over 200. It's basically almost on the northern Bahamas. This is essentially like a Category 5 storm, but it's also like a tornado that's, an EF5 barreling into these islands because that's the type of wind damage. Now, if there's one solace, I can tell you the strongest winds are very close to the center, probably about 25 to maybe 30 miles from the center. So that's why the west side is if you're on the west side, in Florida, this is something you got to watch, but man, you don't want to be anywhere near that eye wall. The pressure continues to fall. Now, the movement is 8, but it looks like it's slowing down in the images that we're seeing now over the last hour or so. I'm going to load the close-up image in here because it is just, it's jaw-dropping to see this eye wall. And I zoomed in real carefully because this is Marsh Harbor, so this is the Bahamas. And the scary part for them is the surge there is going to be 15 to 20 feet with waves on top of that. You can see it moving towards the west. And what's going to happen is this is likely going to stall over these islands. And can you imagine a Category 4 or 5 storm just sitting there for about 36 to 48 hours? Now, that is horrible news for those Bahamas islands there, but that stalling should eventually cause this thing to weaken. One of the things that's interesting about this storm, it hasn't gone through eye wall replacement cycles, which is what you typically see in these strong storms, and that's what you get the up and down, fluctuations in the wind speed, but we haven't seen that yet. So at some point, the eye wall is probably going to collapse, and a new one might form, and that would form a brief weakening trend. But the fact that it's not doing that is a really, really big concern. I'll quickly show you the warnings that are in effect right now. You can see tropical storm warnings up for the coast of Florida. There's a tropical storm watch down to Miami, and obviously hurricane warnings from all of the Bahamas. So from a preparedness standpoint, let me show you what I think everybody should be doing. Up into the Carolinas here, we should be in the ready stage, but all along the coast, everybody, you are in that set stage all the way down to Miami. That means 3 to 5 days out, which in Florida it's a lot closer, but up here in the Carolinas it's 5 days out. And we're inside the forecast cone. Plan and prepare for a storm and evacuate if told. Now, in the red area, you need to leave or get to a safe spot. If you're told to leave by local officials, when I tell people to leave, it's if you're in a flood-prone area, you run from the water and you hide from the wind. So if you're in a non-flood-prone area, then you need to have your house ready to shelter in from strong winds. And that does include the whole coast. Now, we might get very, very lucky and the storm makes a churn and those strongest winds stay offshore. It's just too close, folks. You just can't play chicken with this thing. And just to show you what I think as far as concern level should be right now for this storm, east coast of Florida, it's an extreme concern because if it jaunts a little bit to the west, you're going to be in Category 4 and 5 winds. And the surge is going to be through the roof. The Carolinas, it's a medium threat now, mainly because there's still some uncertainty, and you might be on the west side and might not get the worst winds. But that threat is increasing, especially up here in eastern North Carolina, in particular right in here from Carteret County to the Outer Banks. Very, very concerned. And the whole way, we're going to see big storm surge as well. Just to show you the wind speeds, the rainfall, I'll get to the wind speeds in a second. You can see based on the track, the heaviest rain is going to be offshore. That's because the storm is going to stall down in here. And the heaviest rains will stay until we get to North Carolina, where we could see some amounts that, if you look up here, could be in the 5 to 7, maybe even 10-inch range. But it's going to be a close call. I think combining that with storm surge is really where I would get the biggest concerns. With the fact that we could see flooding in eastern North Carolina. So let me bring up the track here real quickly. And again, the 11 o'clock advisory is going to come out. I don't anticipate a lot of changes. The models have kind of settled in a little bit to this track, but there's some big caveats in that because depending on where that churn occurs, could be close to Florida and close to North Carolina. And like I said before, I don't want to be playing chicken with this thing. You've got a Category 5 storm with some of the strongest winds we've seen in the Atlantic bearing down on you, and you're hoping it churns. So you got to be prepared for the worst in the setup. So here was the advisory at 5 a.m. We should get a new one here probably while I'm uploading this. But winds were 175 miles per hour, gusts to over 200 now. I can update that. Here's the track. Notice how slow it is through about Tuesday morning at 2 a.m. I'm going to stop it right here. We'll stop it right there. And I'll move the map here in a second. So let me play this real quick so I can move the map. There we go. So you can see it's going to be painfully slow moving over the Bahamas. This is just brutal here. Now, Florida, you're going to be on the west side, but here's the thing. This thing could still churn and make a landfall here. So you're not out of the woods in this area. Much better feeling over here. Here, you need to prepare for a Category 4, regardless of whether you think it's coming your way or not, because you got to prepare for it because it's that bad. Now, up into the Carolinas, this is where things get interesting. The storm picks up speed, thank goodness, from a forward speed standpoint. But the question then becomes how close to the coast up here. For Charleston and South Carolina, it's going to stay just far enough offshore. You won't be in the worst winds, but you're going to have some surge. Now, for eastern North Carolina, you're going to have a combination of some wind, some rain, and some surge. And if I go in closer here, you can see how close this gets to the Outer Banks. That is just way too close. And again, that time frame is Friday morning at 2 a.m. And then down here near Charleston, it's 2 a.m. Thursday. So that's a pretty fast-moving system. Hopefully, it'll weaken more than that, but there's no guarantee that's going to happen. So you need to be prepared. So again, if you live in these areas in eastern North Carolina in particular, you need to start getting ready for a hurricane and flooding. And down here, you need to be ready as well in case this churn isn't as sharp. The one thing, because the coast goes back like this, you actually see less cone over land than ocean. And that's one thing to notice. If you want to notice, everyone gets caught up in the middle. I always like to see what percentage of the cone is over water versus what percentage is over land. And when you see more of it over water, that means a lot of it's going to stay to the east. Let's go back to the imagery for a second, because as awe-inspiring and scary as this is, I'm going to widen this out. Oh, why is this loading so slow? We'll loop it. Look at the west side. There's much more, and this is what we talk about with these systems. There's much more wind and rain on the east side. So in fact, if it just moves offshore, you could get really lucky on the west side. The problem is, like I said, you're playing chicken with this thing. Just to show you real quickly, I'm gonna come to this graphic in a minute, but this is the model data. Again, I love the heat map here. Consistently offshore, but boy, very close to Florida, very close to South Carolina, very close to North Carolina. But the core of the guidance is out in here. And it's kind of stabilized. There was that steady shift to the east, but now we've seen it kind of stabilize. Now, I was showing this earlier because this is really important. This is the current forecast from this morning. And what we have here is the surge potential. So notice the track is offshore, but look at these surge numbers in here. And again, let's see if I can I'm going to slide this over a little bit so you can see the scale above my head. So you can see the scale here right above my head. This is mean water height. So you can see even with this track way offshore, look at some of this water in areas in northern Florida, Brunswick, up to Savannah, Charleston, big time water issues here, even with the track offshore. You look at some of these numbers here and you're getting up around 5 to 6 feet of storm surge. And then up here towards Bald Head Island, you've got some big surge. And then going up here in eastern North Carolina, soundside flooding could be a big issue because the winds are going to be coming off the land. So there could be some surge issues here and water being pushed down the sound. So even with the offshore, track, this is why you got to pay attention to this thing and why it could be a big issue. Now, speaking of the track, what's going on with that upper level ridge? Well, let's look at the water vapor loop here as it takes forever to load. A couple things you notice on the water vapor loop here. We're starting to see some of the outflow up here expanding to the north. That's a trend to watch today. And I'm going to let this loop. You see how this is expanding to the north? That's a sign that there's a nudge. There's a little bit of a nudge starting to happen. Not much, but it's expanding and it's slowing down. So the faster this slows down, I said this last night, the quicker that churn happens. We're starting to see the ridge here, which is pushing it west, begin to kind of stall it out, and we're waiting for a trough to come down and weaken the west side of the ridge and then cause it to move out. So I'm looking up here at the trough, and it's not real evident right now. It looks like it's up in here, and eventually moving down. So these are still a lot of moving parts to keep an eye on as this heads up to the coast. Real quickly, the consensus model I just showed you earlier, and I think you got a pretty good feel for it, was basically right on the track. So I overlay the Hurricane Center forecast and the consensus track. Consensus track takes it real close to Florida, really close to North Carolina, and then back out to sea as a 1. So again, the consensus track, and again, I'm just telling you, the consensus track doesn't make landfall, but 2 areas of concern right here, and right here, where it's just too close. So be prepared for this storm. So again, not to get people scared, but it's time to get ready. You've got to be ready for this. Prepare for the worst and hope for the best. The good news is the trend offshore is kind of stabilized. It looks like it's going to stay there, but it's too close to call. You don't want to play chicken with this thing, because if it gets close to you and you're not ready and it decides to jaunt to the west, you're going to be in big time trouble. So be ready for this storm, and hopefully it's not for anything but preparedness. But man, that is just a monster. And again, these poor folks in the northern Bahamas, that thing is going to stall there and sit there for about a day and a half, 2 days. I will post updates throughout the afternoon. I'll post the update coming out here shortly, but I don't expect a lot of change except for it going a little bit further out to sea, extending out 12 more hours.